From the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., welcome to Kennan X, a podcast on our never-ending quest to understand Russia, Ukraine, and the surrounding region. I'm your host, Jill Dougherty. Is Vladimir Putin insane? This is not an idiotic question. I've heard some Russia experts ask it in all seriousness. They've described Putin as an evil madman, a monster. Joe Biden called him a crazy SOB. But is he? After all, these descriptions are based on impressions, and in some cases, yes, they're based on intelligence. But no one so far has climbed into the head of Vladimir Putin. My guest today has done the next best thing. He's part of a team at the Russia program at the George Washington University here in D.C. that's created a linguistic profile of Vladimir Putin, what Putin himself has said over time. As the project's website puts it, Vladimir Putin's speeches are significant. They reveal his thought patterns and illuminate the Kremlin's political logic and intentions, which are often misunderstood. So, welcome, Ivan Grek.
Hello, Jill. Thanks for having me.
Really glad to have you here, Ivan. And just for the record, Ivan is director of the Russia program at GW University's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. He's a political scientist and historian, and he specializes in the studies of illiberal grassroots movements and ideology in Russia. So this is a very intriguing project. It's something that I've thought about so many times. You say, what is Putin thinking? Especially with, in February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I just want to read something, and then we'll get into our discussion here. The website describes it this way, and it's pretty technical. We have amassed a database of more than 1,000 speeches made by Vladimir Putin and applied computational linguistics and advanced AI methodologies to process them. Our analytical interface analyzes over 1,000 of Putin's statements spanning more than 20 years, collected by Rubase, R-U-B-A-S-E, through computational linguistics and network analysis, enabling an in-depth understanding of the Russian president's thought process that goes beyond conventional wisdom. So, with that in mind, can you put that into English, Ivan? What exactly is the concept behind this, and how did you come up with it?
So basically, when the full-scale invasion has started, we've all seen, a surge of the articles that try to discuss that Putin is sick, he has cancer, he got insane, he forgot to take his pills or whatsoever, right? So the decision to invade Ukraine was totally out of any possible sanity or logic, right? And, it is interesting that we're doing a lot of quantitative stuff. So we're looking at numbers, at surges, at graphs and pikes. And we noticed that the pikes in press about Putin's sickness was in 2008, Georgia, 2014, Crimea, 2022, Ukraine, right? So each time Putin starts something audacious, right? The world preferred to interpret it as insanity. Right. However, that's the fourth real insane attempt or whatsoever that we cannot comprehend. However, just being into this political science world, we understand that usually people live within their own ideological models and life worlds, right? The life world will probably be the most appropriate word here to understand the concept. And we have to uncover this life world to understand that logic within it that we cannot comprehend. So this was kind of the driving force behind the project, to take quantitative methods that we don't look under the same lamp all the time with our biases and so on, and look at numbers. So basically the whole idea of this project is to convert his narratives in numbers and to interpret them using math. So if we take the example of a family, we usually expect to see a blurb about traditional values, religiosity, eternal past, and whatsoever. And that's usually what we see when we read a text. He mentions it once, values, and we'll look at it and we try to think about values. But once we take them quantitatively and try to understand what terms are really connected frequently to the term family, we see number of children and the types of financial stimulus to get this number of children out of a family. Very pragmatic. There is nothing about
transactional almost. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, as you and I go, and you lead these conferences a lot over at GW, and many different places at Georgetown where I teach, a lot of the subtext is Putin says a lot, but maybe he's bluffing, maybe he's exaggerating, maybe he's talking to a domestic audience, international. But I think it's very interesting what you're doing is taking over 20 years what he has said and then doing the data analysis. That's really, really valuable. What exactly, by the way, is Rubase, R-U-B-A-S-E?
Yeah, so we have a consortium of data labs that are working on Russia, and this is with the Russia program. We have Digital Lab. So Rubase is one of the projects on the consortium, and they did a great job in collecting and systematizing, because, in data analysis, 70% is to create a good database, right? The rest is only 30%. So they did a great job of scraping all the speeches from Kremlin.ru and distinguishing Putin's direct speech from the rest, so we can track things in time. And yeah, that's an important thing, that we have it for 20 years so we can see the dynamics, which is really interesting, especially nowadays.
That leads me into another question, because there is this theory that Putin, and I remember this very well because it was early times when I was reporting for CNN on Putin, and those days he was talking about economic reform, flat tax, all of this stuff that sounded very good in the West. And then there is a theory that eventually he begins to change and his approach changes. So do you, with your data, think that Putin actually has evolved, maybe in a bad direction, over the past 20 years?
So actually what we see that Putin is really conservative in how he thinks, how he approaches things. And he really started out as a kind of trying to repeat those good democratic statements. He just repeated things, tried to find some sense in them. And in the end of the day, it just didn't work. It's the best thing, from my perspective at least, in how he uses the word future. So until 2022, the future was about projection, model, development, some kind of a really standard language, very bureaucratic language. And in 2022, it appeared that he started to use the words family, faith, people, right? It became even kind of more humanistic in a sense. Once again, it took him 20 years to adapt it, revise kind of his own thinking in a sense, whether that's sincere, whether it can affect, because we need to monitor. But we see the changes there that they just started a year ago, right? And they are really significant, in my opinion, at least. But however, in many other things, he's quite conservative. And, once he settled down with a specific frame of thinking, he stays with it for a really long time, which is an advantage, because his conservative allows us to analyze him and to predict.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking with the 2022 invasion, he definitely got into the existential world. Russia's survival, the West is against us. He said these things, but it did seem to crystallize at that point, and maybe that's what you're referring to, where he began to get more, let's say, philosophical, theoretical, historical. Remember that gigantic treatise that he wrote about Ukraine not being a nation before the invasion, actually, before that invasion. So maybe that is what's going on. But do you think, and let me see if I can phrase this correctly, does he seem like a person who comes from a template, let's say an ideological, maybe I won't use that word because it's such a crazy word in the Russian world, but let's say he comes from a theoretical framework and then fits his comments to that? Or do you think that he's really saying what he thinks?
I think that what we also can track is that Putin has unique understanding of how the grassroots logic of the Russians work, right? So how they do think about things. Let me give you an example here, and then I come to the direct answer to the question. So Putin has a unique feature. He understands the grassroots narratives really well, and he knows how to master them. And basically, one of the examples that I wanted to make is how he uses the term state. He's often criticized for saying things like civil society must serve the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the conclusion is immediate. He wants to subject the civil society to the state. However, once we try to understand what does it mean, the state for him, we see a drastic difference between the terms state, государство, and власть, power. So in Western languages, we usually associate state with management. He does not. The state for Putin is about history. It's about traditions. It's about life. It's about future, right? This is a historical cradle which reproduces the nation. And actually, this state is closer to the Western understanding of the nation. And власть, power, is about administration. It has responsibilities, it has obligations, it has to develop, to see, and so on. And basically, when Putin says that civil society must serve the state, it's kind of, in his thinking, it's closer to the word a nation, right? It must serve the nation, right? However, he wants to be the head of the nation, right? But that's like another question. So why making this example? It's because these were the very findings that I got in my fieldwork in Russia. And that's how people in the 1990s, in the conservative right-wing movement, illiberal civil society is my topic, have defined the state. So he repeats those formulas of the grassroots right-wingers from the early 90s and the late Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, he really is a Soviet man. There's no question. And some of those things from the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of modern Russia, he just continues. It's really true. I want to get back to the team that you have, because I'm struck more and more by the way the field is changing. Let's say when I was coming up and being educated, et cetera, there was a lot of, in-person field work, and my field work was as an exchange student, I have to say, drinking a lot of vodka and talking with people. But now there's a whole generation of data crunchers, people who really can get a lot of fascinating information about Russia from the internet and from other sources too. So can you tell me about your team? How do they collect this when they're scraping this information? How do they actually work?
Yeah, so we have our team basically distributed all over the globe now. And basically what we do at the Russia program is more a scholarly cooperation, than kind of a hierarchical team that is hired full-time or whatsoever. So in our case, we have Kirill Titayev, who is now at Yale University, sociologist of law, and he's kind of the major theoretical driver of quantitative approaches to the studies, right? And we have multiple other people who are doing this and that, helping out and working out the project. I would say the core concept of what we do is the understanding that there is a thing which is called a life world. Life world is something, it's Lebenswelt, right? The old good phenomenological philosophical concept. It's something that shapes our worldviews, and we express it in our speech all the time, right? And we often can try to conceal something, but the language that we use will reveal the life world that drives us. And this is what we hunt for. Considering this framework, we targeted specific groups represented in the internet. They can be socio-demographic groups or wife of the mobilized soldiers, so groups in a special position. We get their expressions and try to understand their life world. So trying to understand those keywords, key concepts that really appear everywhere. And that's why they probably shape their worldviews, right? So, for example, if people, a person says, I hate Putin, Putin is bad, I don't like Putin and whatsoever, we probably can understand that Putin is important, first of all. Maybe this person is lying, right? But Putin is important for the life world. So this is the approach that we take. And then we created a set of scrapers that just help us to extract the texts out of the sources of our interest. It can be Telegram channels, it can be Vkontakte, it can be YouTube, whatsoever, right? So we just need to understand the public we're interested in, where they share their expressions.
Ivan, are there any other conclusions you've come to? I'm thinking like the future, we're all trying to figure out where is he going, not only with the war against Ukraine, but just kind of in general, what his thinking is. Are there any kind of conclusions that you have that you think would be important for where Putin is headed?
So we created this analytical interface to support researchers and people who are working on policy. So this is a tool where you can test your ideas to see how they work and so on. And we have a couple of ideas and a couple of papers coming. So it will be kind of a preview of something to be published soon. So, I mean, first of all, a major conclusion, Putin is not crazy.
Okay, that's definitely, I just want to put that on the record. Putin is not crazy. Okay, that's very important. Okay, number 2.
And moreover, he's rational and quite cold-blooded.
Okay.
So, which is once again good, which means that he's quite conservative and we can predict and understand where things are going sometimes. He makes mistakes. So Putin has a very peculiar life world that we can analyze. We can analyze how he thinks, where it goes to. So his speeches are imprints of ideology that is yet to come. So if we see some new stable expressions that are out there, we know that this Russian officials will start repeating them soon. Russian media will start repeating them soon. And the Russians will probably start repeating them soon as well, right? So he sets the fashion. We can see it, for instance, I had a conversation with one of our colleagues recently who noticed that Russians do want the peace, but that's something not about getting a fair peace deal for Ukraine or whatsoever. That's peace by any means, right? So maybe there shall be no Ukraine, and then there will be peace. That's also good, right? So there is a conversation of they want the peace, but what is that? And a couple of other colleagues in their research noticed that when Russians speak about peace, they speak about multipolarity. They speak about fairness. They speak about the kind of fair world order whatsoever. And we see it exactly in Putin's speeches. It's reflected there 100%. So people who were studying Russians sociologically, focusing on grassroots, got some results. I compared them to our Putin's Head project, and they're the same.
Fascinating.
Right?
Yeah. What about maybe one last question? I'm constantly amazed, and especially at this point where you hear it all the time, how Putin believes that the West is out to get him, that the West is intent on taking over Russia, using its natural resources. And remember, years ago when he was talking about, we are partners. And even today, ironically, he will use that word, our former partners or our former friends. And you can just hear the sarcasm dripping from that one. But why is he so fixated on the United States and how the United States supposedly hates him?
We have on our website, you can see that there is a print screen of Putin's head with the symbols and bubbles. It's out there, so people who would want to check it out can go on our website. And basically, there are two major concepts that generally structures his expressions. One of them is the Russian Federation, and the second one is the United States. So you can see that he explains the world through the United States in many ways, especially when it comes to international relations and foreign business and whatsoever. It always comes to the United States all the time. So here you can go into the kind of psychological argument of that or cultural argument of why the United States is so central. But what we can say is quantitatively, United States is in the middle of his thinking. He's obsessed, and he has always been obsessed with the United States. And one of the commentators made this notice that when Zelensky came to the Congress and he was applauding, being out there, that Putin probably thought that I should have been there.
Yes.
That is, I should have been there, not him. That's, that was the place reserved for me. So that in terms of the future, we arguably can try to predict and understand how Putin would approach the question of nuclear strike using the Putin's head. So we have a paper coming out authored by Spalina Sinavets who tests the hypothesis that Putin pretends to be a madman to scare the West, that he can use the nukes, while in fact being a madman is a rational strategy.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, when it comes to the blurb, and he's like, I'm crazy, I'll start shooting the missiles, right? Don't come close to me. But when it comes to business, he's kind of back to his conservative, traditional political thinking, right, of how to approach things.
Yeah, and then also the kind of good cop, bad cop. The recent meeting in which he was interviewed by Karaganov, one of my favorite characters in modern Russia, who's kind of playing the bad cop of saying, well, we ought to nuke the West. Why don't we just, blow up Washington or whatever? And Putin, as the, of course, adult in the room, now playing the role, says, well, tut. I mean, maybe that's a little too much. After all, that's not in our nuclear doctrine. It's really fascinating to see this. I mean, that's where I think the data can tell you a whole lot. And then there is the, maybe 10% of what Putin does when he's literally playing with the minds of other people. But Ivan Grek, I'm really glad that you were able to give us an insight into the mind of Putin. And what I like also about this new George Washington University site is that you update it. So what he's saying, will be updated, and we'll see the permutations of Putin's mind coming out. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting.
Kennan X is a product of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. It's the Wilson Center's oldest program, founded in 1974 by George F. Kennan, American statesman, James Billington, historian and former Librarian of Congress, and historian S. Frederick Starr. Inspired by them, the Kennan Institute's mission is to improve America's understanding of Russia and the wider region. Thanks for listening.